everybody. Welcome back. Mr. Hartman here again. And today we're going over section 4.5, continuing on our kind of conversation about the European trade empires and the development of those maritime empires. So they talk about, to kind of start this section, we talk about some kind of key things here that really changed the new economic system here with the rise of these maritime empires, right? And so we see a major shift in how trade occurred, right? We see a shift from local small-scale trading, especially in Europe, right? Europe did not have a lot of major trade networks at the time. So we see that shift from local and small-scale trading to large-scale international trade centered around gold and silver. That's the major shift occurring trade-wise during this era, right? And then they talk about some financing stuff, which we'll talk about, right? We'll talk about the rest of that stuff here. And so as we kind of go into the section about economic strategies, okay, so the same kind of ideas that we talked about in previous sections, right, with the rise of mercantilism, right, the accumulation of gold and silver through a export-oriented economy, and as well as control of their colonies, right, became the popular economic system of the 17th century, right? And so we also see the accumulation of material wealth, right, or the accumulation of capital in Western Europe during this time period, mostly through their control of these trade networks based around mercantilism, right? Right, as what they called entrepreneurs, right? Businessmen essentially engaged in long distance trade. Okay, and so on top of this, we start to see laborers, right, become more wealthy as well, as they are paid by these entrepreneurs, which leads to the purchase of, well, more goods, right? Which allows them to buy more of these things that these entrepreneurs are selling, which leads to more wealth, kind of creating this positive feedback loop of, when entrepreneurs become more wealthy, they give more money to their laborers or hire more laborers. These laborers spend that extra money that they have on the goods that other entrepreneurs or the entrepreneurs that hired them are producing as well, right? Right. We also see investment become commonplace in Catholic or Christian Europe, despite that not really being a big thing for the church, right? And so we also see that we see this whole switch, this transformation of the European economy, considered the commercial revolution, right? And so the commercial revolution is the transformation to a trade-based economy of Europe, right, away from a more agricultural focused economy, right? And it's going to kind of lead us into some other major shifts in European economy that's going to have massive implications going forward. And they talk about 4 key factors leading to this commercial revolution. All right, the overseas colonies. That's kind of the real frontline change here. Which of course will also then lead to, well, not lead to per se, but be impacted one way or the other by new ocean trade routes. We also see population growth as a major change that really helps more trade occur, and then inflation occurring as well as one of the major causes of the commercial revolution, right? Which is due to both the increasing population and the also increasing amount of gold and silver being circulated in the economy, right? And this high rate of inflation is also known as the price revolution. Right, which drastically changes, how money works, basically, in this economy, and leads to a higher demand for money. Right. On top of all this, we also see, and kind of going one of the major aspects of the commercial revolution is the rise of joint stock companies. Okay, so joint stock companies were owned by investors who bought stock in that company and then received dividends based on the profits of that company, every usually 3 months, at least nowadays, right? Um, who bought, let's call it shares. I think that's a little easier to understand. Who bought shares in the company, right? Um, so these investors both get the profits and the risks of these explorations, but we also see a thing here: limited liability kind of come to the forefront. Okay, so limited liability is that an individual investor is not responsible for debts or other things that are outside of their control that the company takes on, right? Right, the company is responsible for that. Okay, which makes investing much safer, right? They investors have a very hands off approach, right? They are literally only giving money to the company, and then the company is expected to return profits to them, right? Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that the investors have full control, and in fact, what you see is that when a company does have debt and stockholders, right? If the company is making profit, or if the company is forced to go bankrupt, the first people who are always paid in that situation are those who hold their debt, right? Or at least they're supposed to be the people who are paid, right? Um, and so, with the rise of the the joint stock companies and the rise of the commercial revolution, right? One of the key components of this, right, is the rising middle class in Europe, right? The middle class is mostly defined by those merchants, and so as we're seeing more trade, we're also seeing growth of the middle class. The middle class doesn't necessarily just mean that they're sort of wealthy, right? They have more wealth than the poor, than the lower class, the peasants, but less than the nobles. At this point, what we're actually seeing is that a lot of this middle class, especially some of these merchants, are actually becoming more wealthy than the nobles. And so, usually we see social class determined by wealth, but at this particular time period, what we're starting to see is that this middle class is outstripping the wealth of the nobles, but they're not joining the rank of the nobles because at this point, over centuries of land accumulation, right, the nobility has such entrenched power over this society that the middle class merchants cannot make their way into those power structures, which is going to lead to some major changes politically and socially, especially in France later on. Okay. Um, and so this rising middle class in Europe also leads to an increase in demand for those kind of um, foreign luxuries, right? Silk, spices, cotton, pepper, right? Those kind of things that we see coming out of the Indian Ocean Trade Network. And then they kind of talked about the development of some of these stock companies, right? The Dutch, British, and the French in particular, right? The Dutch, British, and French all have their own companies, uh, have joint stock companies. And in fact, they have laws, especially the Dutch and the British. They create laws that are very beneficial for them. However, in Portugal and Spain, right, we have a government controlled. The government does most of the investing, right? Which is not going to be good in the long run. It's going to lead to some problems, right? Um, and so these joint stock companies are a major motivator for overseas colonization, especially for the British. The British East India Company will be the lead in Indian colonization. Okay. Very briefly, I'm gonna not necessarily focus too much on the Dutch roles in commerce, right? But the Dutch were kind of leading innovators in commerce and trade. Okay, they had superior ships for a very long time. Um, they had a highly successful uh, uh, joint stock company pretty much before anybody else did. They had faster, lighter ships. They had a successful stock company, the Dutch East India Stock Company, or also known as the VOC, successful stock company. And then monopolized the spice trade after they were kind of displaced the Portuguese in Southeast Asia, right? So they were very, very powerful economically at first. They had a stock exchange in 1602, very early on for stock exchanges, right, which allows you to buy and sell your different shares of companies on an open market. Right, we have international currency trade at the Bank of Amsterdam. They had the highest standard of living at this time, right? Basically means like how good their lives are. And they had the higher standard of living at this time. It's small. It's a small country, but also very successful at what it's doing at this point. France and England, meanwhile, kind of our other two financial innovators, actually struggle early on with financial bubbles. Not really, with this new system in place. Right, what you see happen is over speculation on these joint stock companies. Right, they look like such huge profit makers that a lot of people start to invest in them, and then when those investments don't pay out, right, you see the massive price of those shares of those companies actually not being worth it. So you see a massive sell off leading to a bubble burst, and lots of investors losing money in these early years of stock trading. Okay. All right, let's go over the triangular trade. This is probably something you are also familiar with from U.S. history, but this is the setup of the ships, the voyages of ships in the Atlantic Ocean, because they often tend to go in a triangle, right? So the way it works is that we see ships go from Europe to Africa, and what they bring with them is manufactured goods. And mostly when we mean manufactured goods, the most important one to take into account is guns. But they'd also bring stuff like horses and rum and stuff like that. From Africa to the Americas is very obviously slaves. Okay. And then from the Americas to Europe would come raw materials, right? Sugar, tobacco, gold and silver. Okay. Um, Sugar being the most popular, right? And then a lot of times the Europeans would come back, make those goods, turn those into man-made goods, and then sell them back to the Americas, right? So we also kind of had this return leg between Euro and the Americas, creating manufactured goods for the colonists to consume. Right. Again, this is all in the ideas of mercantilism. So it's colonies trading with their mother states, and their mother states trading with the colonies. Right. Um, they talk about rivalries for the Indian Ocean trade. Not too much to focus on here. We talked about this a lot. Um, we see Portugal kind of defeat a Muslim and Venetian force. I think this is the third chapter this has come up in at this point. For control, but they do lose to Morocco to try to control the Strait of Gibraltar, right? And then we also see the Morocco forces defeat Songhai in battle, which is not part of the Indian Ocean, but that's okay. This is West Africa. Using their camels and horses and cannons and guns to defeat the gunless Songhai, which allows for the Spanish and Portuguese to take over a lot of that territory that the Songhai give up. Right. Okay. So let's talk about kind of some changes and continuities in trade networks. The major change being the development of European monopolies of goods, especially for joint stock companies. Right, we see the joint stock companies kind of take hold of these monopolies. Um, some examples. The example they bring up is Spanish tobacco. Right, so Spain controls most, if not all, tobacco production in the Americas. The British, though, right, do have some tobacco themselves. Right, but some ones that they didn't talk about, I want to bring up very briefly, is we see the Dutch control spices coming out of Southeast Asia, and the British control cotton coming out of India. Right, which is going to make them a lot of money. Right, having that monopoly allows them to raise the price that they sell that for. Okay, the continuity though that we see is the continuation of regional markets. Right, regional markets are less important. Right, but we still seem to have the growth of these regional markets. Right. We see regional markets continue throughout Afro-Eurasia. Afro-Eurasia, again, being the massive land that is Africa, Europe, and Asia, and especially with the growth of the this whole trade network, right, and all these trade innovations, right. We see an increase in volume of trade as merchants have new innovations to allow the amount that they're trading, right. And then on top of that, right, we see the growing wealth of the middle class, especially in Europe. Creates more demand for trade. Right. So we see change in the European monopolies over these goods, right? Previously, it wasn't not just that the Europeans didn't exist in these trade networks, it's that nobody had a monopoly, right? It was its own, people just bought and sold it as see fit. But the continuity being the continuation of regional trade. It hasn't disappeared entirely. Okay. Effects of the Atlantic slave trade. Okay. So we have talked a little bit about the Kingdom of the Congo. And here we kind of see the decline of the Kingdom of the Congo due to slave trade, right? The decline in population growth because they're, trading their people away for slavery, right? And then we also see trade competition lead to violence, trade competition with the Europeans. Okay. But then on top of this, they also become economically dependent on the Europeans. Okay. And so we see them not develop their own economies, which is going to leave them kind of ripe for European colonization in the 19th century. We see the slave raid states kind of become very powerful, especially too that they want to point out the kingdoms of Dahomey and Oyo out in West Africa. And so, yeah, we see the trade for guns, right, makes them more powerful in relation to their neighbors as well, in particular, right. We also see we've talked about this before, right? But we see the gender imbalance in Africa as more men are taken into slavery, and women begin to outnumber men in these societies, which leads to polygamy, the taking of several wives by one male. Okay, and then we also see women take on the traditional roles of men. Right. And though, despite the population decrease from trade on the whole, we see a population increase in Africa due to the Columbian Exchange. And in particular, the goods that we see become important are millet, or sorry, not millet. I apologize. Manioc, maize, and peanuts. Right, kind of new. They diversify the diet, but then they're also able to um, be produced in new territories. Right. Okay. So political changes in the Americas, and kind of before we get to this, right? Previously, we've seen um, in previous imperial societies, right? What we've seen is a attempt to integrate indigenous cultures and integrate subject cultures into the empire, right? As a way to try to keep those subject peoples happy, right? What we see is that the empires, the Romans, the Muslims, and the Mongols, they allow for the indigenous or the local cultures of their subjects to continue on as a way to keep them happy. But now what we're seeing is the European empires are very different in that they are basically wiping out in these subject cultures, especially in the Americas. Right, whether that's purposeful or accidental due to the devastation of the population due to disease, I'm sure it's a little bit of both, right? But yeah, they depopulated, basically got rid of the local culture. But politically, what we have here, we have the Spanish viceroys, right? Viceroys basically run the governments, right? They are the administrators of the Spanish colonies. There are two Spanish colonies, New Spain and New Castile, right? And to keep these viceroys in check, we have audiencias, right, which are royal courts to check the power of the viceroys, right? And so we could see these were basically appeals courts, right, where settlers could appeal decisions by the viceroys, right? The big issue here is that we see the kind of slow communication networks back to Spain, to Europe, leads to kind of a hands-off approach. Not necessarily being able to control their colonies there. They kind of leave it up to the viceroys and the audiencias, right? In case of the case an emergency happens, right? Unless an emergency happens, I should say, right? We see kind of the full-blown destruction of a lot of indigenous culture. Cortez and the early conquistadors burned a lot of books because they were unholy, right? We have a lack of first-hand accounts because of this, right? And so due to this, right, we see a lot of the sources about the Aztecs are written by the Spanish, right? Especially the Nahuatl language, right? However, we do have some reliable sources. We do have mostly unreliable sources here about Aztec society, about indigenous culture, as again they're mostly Spanish, and so they're going to have a bias against the indigenous cultures. But let's see, let me make sure I get this. Bernardino de Sahagún. He compiles the Florentine Codex, which is a book about the indigenous cultures, right? About Aztec life before the conquest, right? He is a missionary slash priest, and actually, what we do see is missionaries tend to be one of the more kind of cautious about destroying indigenous culture, right? Which is ironic considering the desire to spread their religion. And then eventually we see kind of the blending of Spanish culture with the indigenous, but for the most part, we see Spanish Portuguese culture overtakes indigenous culture pretty universally. Not totally universally, but pretty close, right? They talk about Guatemala and Mexico, mountainous areas of Mexico keeping indigenous traditions. And then we see they very briefly, for some reason, talked about the Creoles, who are Spanish ethnicity, but born in the Americas. They will eventually want to take power in their colonies, and we'll talk about that. We need to talk about that a little more. Religion in the Americas. We have a lot of syncretic beliefs created in the Americas, especially between the African religions and Christianity, or African traditions and Christianity. And there are three they want to bring up here. They are Santeria, Voodoo, or Vodun, and Candomblé. Okay. This is popular in Cuba. It means the way of the saints, so it focuses a lot on worshiping the saints. This means spirit or deity. This came out of the Dahomey and Congo people and becomes very popular in Haiti. And then Candomblés dance to the honor of the gods with Yoruba, Fawn, and Bantu beliefs, and is most popular in Brazil. So among the Portuguese slaves, right? So yeah, we see some Muslim slaves make their way over. I'm not going to focus too much on that, but we do see we see a lot of Christian missionaries sent over to convert people to Christianity. Right, the specifically are kind of big three of Christian Catholic, let's say, missionaries, the Dominicans and Franciscans, and then of course the Jesuits, right? And they are very successful. And most today, most of Latin America is in fact Catholic, so that kind of rings to their massive success. One of the major aspects of kind of the mix of indigenous culture with the religion of Catholicism is the Virgin of Guadalupe and her worship in Mexico in particular. She was able to perform miracles, right? And so that kind of comes in with the Mexican indigenous culture, where miracles were kind of a part of their original ideas, right? We also, let's go over here. Sikhism, they're kind of throwing this here at the end, is a blend of Islam, Sufi mystics, and Hinduism. Develops in India. We've talked about that already. We see the different schisms, right, really develop here, right? The Sunni Shia splits leads to the Ottoman and Safavid conflicts. And then lastly, I'm going to have to put it over here. I'm running out of space. Lastly, the Protestant Reformation is going to lead to a lot of settlements in North America of kind of persecuted Protestants. Right. Okay, and that's going to do it for section 4.5 as these maritime empires develop. Right. In our next section, we are going to be talking about challenges to the state power of the era, both from within these states and from without. But until then, I'll see you in the next one.